Tonight we discuss the lives of medieval peasants. We will focus on their resilience, that these were the everyday people of the Middle Ages. They survived some very cold historical periods. They used various methods to stay warm. They had tricks for tessellating their homes. They also used communal sleeping strategies. Their story is one of simple determination. So now we will begin our quiet exploration. When you imagine medieval life, you might think of knights. You might picture grand feasts and fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was a serious time. It was less about celebration. It was more about basic survival. Winter was not merely a season, it was an annual test of human endurance. It was a recurring challenge for everyone now. Picture a typical peasant home. It was a small hut made of mud and sticks. The walls were often very thin. There was usually no real insulation. There were no glass windows to speak of. There was just a small opening in the wall. This opening might be covered with animal skin. There was no central heating system. The temperature inside was barely different from outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was cold indoors. It was only slightly less cold inside the structure. The nights were particularly difficult. The darkness was very deep and complete. The wind would often make sounds as it blew. The fire in the hearth was usually small. It provided only a little heat. It mostly warmed the person sitting closest to it. If you were across the room, you received little benefit. You might as well have been outside, but you would have had worse snacks. Their clothing was not very effective. Peasants did not own expensive fur coats. They did not have down-filled blankets. They typically had a few wool tunics. They might have had a simple cloak. This cloak might have had a distinct smell. They hoped that blaring would keep them warm. This was like being a human onion. However, this method was not entirely successful. Their beds were not soft or comfortable. Beds were often just sacks filled with straw. Sometimes dried rushes were added. There were also fleas in the bedding. This was a common inconvenience. The cold was more than just an annoyance. It was a genuine danger to their health. Frostbite was a constant risk. Hypothermia was also a common concern. Freezing to death was a real possibility. This was especially true for the very young. It was also true for the very old. Waking up each morning was a small victory. It was considered a minor miracle. Might be celebrated with a simple breakfast. This breakfast might include a cold turnip. Surviving a medieval winter was not about comfort. It was about pure endurance. It involved wearing all your clothes. It involved huddling for warmth. It involved hoping to wake up without ice on your face. And so the daily adventure continued. If you think your home is drafty, consider the past. Medieval homes were not just drafty. They were essentially wind tunnels. They just happened to have a roof on top. Most peasant houses were built in a certain way. Historians call this wattle and daub. This means sticks were woven together. They were then covered with a mud mixture. This mixture included straw. It also sometimes included animal dung. This was not for gross reasons. Dung was a cheap and available material. It acted as a simple insulator. However, these walls were not very strong. The winter wind found every gap. It would easily enter the one-room home. It would swirl around inside. It prevented anyone from getting too warm. There was no privacy in these homes. There was also very little warmth. It was, however, a character-building experience. The roofs were made of thatch. They looked quite nice from a distance, but after some time, they would sag. They would also leak water. Sometimes small animals would get inside. This could be an unexpected event. Windows were very small, if they existed. They were often covered with animal hides. Sometimes wooden shutters were used. Glass was much too expensive for peasants. Even wealthy lords had little glass, so peasants used what they could find. Floors were usually just packed dirt when it rained. Mud could seep upward, so they had a form of indoor water feature. They likely did not appreciate this feature. In winter, the floor was very cold. The cold came from the ground below. It also came from the air. Above, it was a complete feeling of cold. But peasants did not usually complain. They stuffed gaps with moss. They used old rags to block drafts. They huddled close together for warmth. This was a form of human insulation. They used creativity and stubbornness. They sometimes used sheep, grease on walls. This was their main defense against the cold. It was a simple and basic form of protection. The frozen ground itself was another challenge. Floors were not finished floors. They were just flat areas of earth. Sometimes straw was thrown down for comfort, but this was only an illusion of comfort. You were still very close to the cold ground. The cold from the earth was relentless. It would seep up through the straw. It would go into your bones. It felt like it reached your soul. If you dropped something, it became cold. It was like adding to the permafrost. Peasants tried to fight the cold floor. One method was to use thick straw mats. This was if you could afford the straw dot, or if you could take it from a neighbor. This provided a thin, insulating layer, but the straw would flatten quickly. It could also become moldy over time. It made a crunching sound when you moved. Some homes used dried rushes instead. They would put new rushes over the old. They did not clean out the old rushes. This created a layered ecosystem. It contained decomposing plants. It also contained fleas and other creatures. It was an early form of carpet padding. If that carpet was slightly alive and damp, beds did not help very much either. They were often simple wooden frames. These frames were filled with straw or hay. They were not cozy mattresses. They were pokey and shifting. They did little to stop the cold from below. Tossing and turning was not for comfort. It was to keep your blood circulating. It was to avoid freezing on one side. The truth is, they did not conquer the cold. They just learned to live with it. A good night's sleep was not about dreams. It was about waking up with all your toes. And if you did that, you were doing well. The hearth was the hero of the home. It was not the roof or the walls. It was the simple fire pit. It was a crackling and stubborn fire. It was the main defense against the cold. It also fought the darkness of winter. It was the center of nearly every home. It was not a fancy stone fireplace. It had no neat chimney for the smoke. It was a basic pit or pile of stones. It had some half-burned logs. It produced a lot of smoke in the room. This smoke made the air thick. Most homes did not have proper chimneys. The smoke would drift out through holes. It left through cracks in the walls, or it simply stayed in the room with you. This was not good for your lungs, but it did help with pest control. It fumigated the fleas in the home. The hearth was not just for warmth. It was also used for cooking food. It was the main source of light after dark. It was like a medieval television. People would sit around it and talk. They would tell stories or share gossip. Sometimes they just stared at the flames. There was not much else to do at night. Keeping the fire going was very important. Letting it go out was a serious problem. It was like inviting the cold inside. Restarting a fire was not easy. Had to use flint and steel. You needed dry kindling. You also needed a lot of patience. Every family member had a job done. Someone had to stoke the flames. Someone had to watch the embers. Someone had to add fuel to the fire. It was a constant battle. Against the cold, the hearth did not guarantee survival, but survival was very hard without it. It was a smoky and sputtering fire, but it was the heart of the home. It was a small beacon of hope. The fear of a dead fire was great. It was worse than running out of ale without the fire. The cold came quickly. Restarting a fire was a difficult task. It could also be a deadly one. Matches had not been invented yet. Lighters were a distant dream. To restart a fire, you struck flint. You prayed for a single spark. You nurtured that spark with kindling. Imagine doing this in the dark. Your fingers would be very cold. You might be only half awake. Wolf might howl in the distance. This was extra motivation to work fast. So peasants learned to bank the fire. This did not mean putting it in a bank. It meant burying the embers in ash. They did this right before going to sleep. The ash acted like a warm blanket. It kept the coals alive until morning. If done correctly, you could restart the fire. You would just poke the pile and add wood. Then you would have fire again. If you did it wrong, the morning was cold. It was also a grumpy morning. Fire banking was a learned skill. It was passed from parents to children. Everyone had their own little method. Some people used only dry ash. Others thought damp ash was better. Some packed the embers very tightly. Others left them a little loose. It was a common topic of discussion. It was like arguing over cooking techniques, but the stakes for survival were higher. Sometimes banking was not enough. A strong wind could put the fire out. A farm animal might stumble into it. This did happen on occasion. So Sometimes families took turns at night. One person would get up to check the coals. This was the medieval version of a thermostat in the end. Fire banking was a simple act. It was about buying a few more hours of warmth. Waking up to a single ember was a victory. It was enough to face another cold day. The phrase, "the more, the merrier," was literal. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire was low, people needed warmth. The best source of warmth was other people. This meant sleeping very close. Together, you would sleep next to your whole family. Might sleep near your neighbors. Your livestock might also be nearby. Even a confused goose might join. Personal space was not a priority. Privacy was not really a concept. On the coldest nights, comfort did not matter. The goal was to not freeze overnight. Whole households piled into one corner. They used whatever cloth they could find. They formed a large sleeping group. It was like a human lasagna. Young children slept between parents. Grandparents were included in the pile. If a cousin visited, they joined too. There was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you slept in the middle. Body heat came from all sides there. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge. That was like sleeping by a cold door. If you moved too much, it was a problem. You might knock someone into a draft. Then you would be unpopular. Sometimes bedding was also shared. This was a communal straw mattress. It flattened under the weight of people. Hygiene was not a high priority, so it was not a fragrant arrangement. But when facing frostbite, you were not picky. Body heat was a strategic resource. Guides recommended a specific order. The warmest people slept on the outside. They were like human shields. Babies and the elderly were in the center. They were the most vulnerable. This was not just about survival. It became part of daily family life. Long nights led to storytelling. They lead to singing songs. There were interesting conversations. These happened under shared blankets. So, sleeping was a communal activity. It was a necessity for survival. Animals were brought inside for winter. This was not a quirky tradition. It was a vital source of warmth. Livestock generated body heat in a poorly insulated home. Every degree helped also. Your goat was safer inside. It was less likely to be stolen. This solved two problems at once. At night, the house became a living furnace. Chickens nested in the corners. Pigs snorted near the hearth. Cows leaned against the walls. They chewed their food slowly. It was not a glamorous situation. The smells were very strong. By spring, the air was quite potent. You did not need to light a candle. Your nose was already very busy. But peasants did not complain much. They knew a simple fact. More animals meant fewer frozen toes. Some animals had prime spots. Cows were the biggest and warmest. They were usually near the family. Goats were allowed to be close. They were warm and also stubborn. Chickens roosted in the rafters. Pigs did not care about personal space. They lay down wherever they wanted. This was often in the middle of the floor. Sharing a room with animals had hazards. You might be woken up. Suddenly, a chicken might land on your head, might step in something unpleasant. Yes, medieval mornings held surprises, but despite the noise and the smells, and despite the occasional hoof, peasants understood the simple math that cold weather could kill you. A warm cow could save you, even if the cow did not want to be there. In medieval winters, fashion was functional. It was not about looking attractive. It was about not dying from the cold. Peasants did not follow fashion trends. They just wore every piece of clothing they owned. Sometimes they wore it all at once. First, they put on an undertunic. This was a scratchy linen shirt. Over that, they wore a woolen tunic. Then they might add another tunic. They also wore simple leggings. They wore a rough cloak over their shoulders. If they were lucky, they had sheepskin. They would throw this on top then. They were slightly warmer, but they were also much. Chia. Boots were a rare luxury. Many people wrapped their feet in cloth. They stuffed peas into wooden clogs if it was still cold. You added more rags. You hoped you did not lose a toe. Washing clothes in winter was hard. You had to go to a frozen stream. You had to break the ice. Then you waited days for your shirt to dry. It might just freeze into a shirt-sicle. But most people decided not to wash. Smelling like smoke and sheep was better. It was better than freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt had a benefit. The grime built up on the clothes. This layer actually locked in body. Heat. It was like a medieval waterproof jacket. It was just much smellier. Hats and gloves were prized items. A simple wool cap could save your life. It could prevent your hair from freezing. Gloves were often homemade from scraps. They sometimes looked like sad puppets. Children were wrapped up very tightly. They looked like overstuffed turnips. They waddled around the home. The goal was to trap body heat. Style was not a consideration. Warmth was the only thing that mattered. Medieval clothing was very practical. It was all about survival. Dirt was not just dirt to medieval peasants. It was actually a survival tool. Getting dirty was not a sign of giving up. It was a tactical and strategic decision. Winter caused a problem of heat loss. Clean clothes were not very warm. They were breathable, which was bad when the air was freezing. Breathable was cold. So dirt helped solve this problem. As peasants went without washing, grime built up. Layers of mud and body oils accumulated. This natural layer clogged the fabric gaps. It made the clothes more wind-resistant. It was like a form of weatherproofing. It was just a much smellier version. You might smell like an unhappy goat, but you were also significantly warmer. Some people believed washing was unhealthy. They thought it could make you sick. It was better to keep the dirty barrier. Bathing was a very rare event. Laundry was even more rare. Soap was saved for special occasions, like a visit from the bishop or right before you died. Peasants also layered without changing. You just put a new layer over the old one. After a while, you were a walking museum. Every stain told a story from the past weeks to outsiders. It looked like they gave up, but the peasants knew the truth. That dirty tunic was a thermal shield. It was not glamorous, but it worked. Freezing to death was less glamorous. Besides, everyone smelled the same. So, you were not offending anyone. Nose blindness was very common in medieval winters. Dirt was not failure. It was a form of function. It was a form of fashion. If you had a greasy layer by February, you were winning. Medieval beds were not what we imagine. They were not plush feather beds. They were not soft or embroidered dirt. The reality was much more basic. It was sleeping on a pile of dead plant. You just hoped for the best outcome. Beds were usually a wooden frame. This was if you could afford one. It was covered with a large sack. The sack was stuffed with straw or hay. Sometimes old rushes were used. There was no memory foam. There was no orthopedic support. It was not a 5-star hotel experience. It was a crunchy and lumpy mess. It smelled faintly of barnyard. Every time you moved, it made noise. You might get poked by a piece of straw. Some peasants skipped the frame entirely. Just put the straw on the dirt floor. This was a ground-level sleeping experience. Modern influencers might call it earth-connected. The straw mattresses did not last long. Over time, the straw flattened down. It could grow mold after a while. It attracted bugs and other creatures. It became a biological hazard. Changing the straw was a big job. It was done a few times a year, or when the bed started moving by itself. Rushes were another option. These long grasses were spread on the floor. Sometimes herbs were mixed in. This was to mask the smell of animals. The fresh rushes smelled nice for a day. Then they became part of the floor. They blended with dirt and food scraps. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, and lice loved the straw bedding. If you woke up scratching, you were not alone. You were living the authentic medieval life. Despite the hardships, the beds helped. The straw provided insulation from the ground. Sleeping together on them created warmth. It was a form of medieval central heating. So, these humble beds were actually lifesavers. They were a crucial part of winter survival. Medieval homes had many cracks. The walls warped and the mud crumbled. The thatch on the roof would sag. The cold wind found every single gap. It would sneak inside every night. It was like a mischievous ghost. Sealing the house was an important art. Peasants stuffed gaps with whatever they found. They used moss and straw, used scraps of old cloth. They used bundles of dry grass. Sometimes they used animal hair. If it was soft, it was jammed into a hole. Some people added more mud outside. They did this as an annual winter project. Imagine slapping manure on your wall. You would do this in the freezing weather. You would tell yourself it was fine, because, in a way, it was a form of luxury. Roof leaks were another problem. Thatch was not very waterproof. After some rain and snow, it would leak. Peasants plugged holes with spare cloth. They used bundles of reeds or grass. In desperation, they used chunks of turf. Every home looked like a patchwork quilt. It was made by someone who gave up. Doors and windows were simple. They were wood planks hung with nails. Window holes were covered with animal hides. Sometimes cloths soaked in fat was used. This blocked drafts and added a smell. The smell was like mystery meat. Every night was a battle. It was between people and the cold. 1 minute you were almost warm. The next, a gust of wind found a gap. It would slap you awake. It was like a frosty hand. Yet, through cleverness and stubbornness, and a refusal to be permanently frozen. Medieval peasants patched their homes. They stuffed and muddled their way through. They survived. 1 winter at a time. 1 handful of mud at a time. When the cold was too severe for sleep, peasants used a simple strategy. They did not all sleep at once. Instead, they slept in shifts. It was not an organized military system. It was a simple and desperate measure. Half the household stayed awake. They tended the fire and patched drafts. The other half tried to sleep. They slept under thin blanket and hay. The fire needed constant attention. If left alone, it would die out. Restarting it was very difficult, so someone had to watch the embers, since no one wanted to get up. Cold. Families took turns sleeping. You slept for a few hours then. You were elbowed awake. You stumbled to the hearth. You poked the fire back to life. You tried not to step on a goat. The rotation was not glamorous. There were no night vision goggles. There were no late night snacks. There was no snooze button. There were just stiff joints and heavy eyes. You resented the person who snored. Even children helped with the fire. They learned early to pull their weight. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer. Arthritis made lying down difficult when it was your turn to sleep. It was hard. People were moving around. Animals were rustling. The wind was battering the walls. You might get nudged by a sibling. Getting good rest was a miracle. Yet, the system actually worked. Sleeping in shifts kept the hearth alive. The embers survived, and so did the family. It was a necessary disruption. It was a strategy for survival. Medieval peasants even controlled their breathing. The cold air was dangerous to inhale. Deep, open-mouthed breathing was a risk. It pulled icy air straight into the lungs. Pneumonia could kill you very quickly, so peasants learned survival breathing. They did not take huge gulps of air. They kept their breathing shallow and slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to warm the air a little. It was not perfect, but it was better. A big mouthful of cold air was bad. It could lead to a week of coughing. There were no doctors to help you. You would be treated. Put onion, tea, and prayers. Some people slept with cloth over their faces. They tucked part of their cloak over their mouth. This created a makeshift breath warmer. Of course. It became damp by morning, but it was better than freezing your lungs. Children were taught these tricks early. Parents scolded them for panting like dogs between breathing lessons and itchy clothes and sleeping next to a gassy goat. Medieval childhood was character-building. At night, breathing was an art form. It was slow, steady, and through the nose. It was as minimal as possible. It was like a grim yoga retreat, but with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. It was not a flashy survival strategy, but it worked well enough. One shallow breath at a time. Peasants endured another winter. Night. A full stomach was a secret weapon. One of the best ways to fight the cold was to eat a heavy meal before bed. Calories created internal body warmth. The more your body digested, the more heat it made. It was basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal. Generate heat, maybe survive until the morning. So, what did they eat before bed? They ate thick and hearty stews. These were full of root vegetables. Turnips, onions, and parsnips were common. Grains were also very important. Oat, porridge, or barley. Gruel were staples. Dense rye bread was also eaten. On a good day, you might have salted pork, or a slice of dried sausage in the stew. This was not comfort food for pleasure. It was not presented in an artistic way. It was one large, brown meal. It was designed to sit in your stomach. It would burn slowly through the night. It would keep you a little bit warmer. It was not just about eating a lot. It was about eating the right foods. Foods that digested slowly were best. They provided a steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly good. Fat burns slower. Bend lean meat. A belly full of stew and lard was luxury. Parent made sure children ate heartily. No one cared if you did not like turnip. You ate the turnips or you shivered. It was harsh but effective parenting. Of course, heavy eating had downsides. You might be warmer, but you had dreams. Vivid and bizarre dreams from your stomach. Your stomach processed a field of cabbages. But was it worth it? Absolutely, it was worth it. Because the goal was not a gourmet meal. The goal was simple. Survival. And if that meant going to bed very full, and breathing through your nose next to a steaming cow, then that was just another winter night. Peasants used simple tools for warmth. The humble haybox was one example. It was a wooden box lined with hay. It was used to store cooked food. The hay kept the food warm for hours. Leftover stew or porridge went inside. It was a medieval slow cooker, but they also used it for rocks. They would heat a flat stone in the fire. They heated it until it was very hot. Then they fished it out with a stick. The stone was wrapped in rags that it was tucked into a clay pot. Then it was slipped under the hay in the bed. It was a medieval heating pad. There were risks. Of course, if you did not wrap the stone properly, you could have a small fire in your bed. If you dropped it, you could burn your foot. Winter injuries were not always from ice, but when it worked, the stone provided comfort. It gave precious warmth for hours. It was not a luxurious item, but in a half-frozen hut, it was a miracle. Luxury was not waking up with icicles, so the heated stone was a tiny marvel. It was a simple but effective tool. Sleeping arrangements were strategic. The closer you were to the fire, the better your spot. Was not about personal preference. It was about survival and status. Infants and the elderly got the best spots. Parents and older children fanned out. They acted as human insulation layers. A spot near the fire was a necessity. It was basic survival mathematics. Babies were fragile but generated heat. Elders held family, knowledge, and gossip. Protecting them with warmth was important, but it was a delicate balance. Too close, and you could get burned. Your hair might singe from the flames. Your cloak might start to smolder too far, and you were in an ice box. You had to stay near the fire's glow, but not so near that you got roasted. The fire did not spread heat evenly. It mostly warmed the people directly in front. Everyone else fought for a narrow cone of heat. It was like cold lizards in the sun. If you slept facing the fire, one side was warm, the other side was frozen solid. Pets and livestock also joined in. A dog might wedge itself near the fire. Its tail might wag near the flames. Chickens perched on the hearthstones. They clucked softly through the night. Every crackle of the fire was a promise. It meant you were still alive. You were still warm for now. So peasants drifted into uneasy sleep. They were lulled by the fire's sounds. Each breath formed a small cloud beyond the fire's fragile circle. It was frigid. It was not a perfect system. It was not a comfortable one. But it was life, clinging to warmth. It was life clinging to glowing coals. No one survived winter completely alone. Survival was a village project. It was a messy and loud collaboration. Everyone's warmth depended on everyone else. If a neighbor's fire went out, you noticed if the smoke stopped. Someone checked. This was not just about being friendly. Sometimes it was about a owed chicken. But mostly, it was about community. Community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers. These were often the young or elderly. They could not work in the fields, but they could watch for signs of trouble. They noticed who was coughing too hard. They noticed who missed the market. They noticed whose home was too still. They were neighborhood patrol, but without reflective vests and with more sheep around. If a family's fire died, it was an emergency. A good neighbor would bring a burning coal, or they would invite them into their own home. This meant squeezing in more people, but it was better than finding frozen friends. Communal food stores also helped during brutal winters. Resources were shared. Villagers pooled their last supplies. Salted meat, grain, and vegetables were shared. It was a grim form of charity. No one had very much to give, but a few communal meals could save, tell lives. Even children understood their role. They helped deliver firewood. They shared embers with neighbors. They ran messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired. When winter came, everyone helped. Medieval villages were not perfect. Feuds happened over land and animals. Disputes over borrowed pots occurred. But during the deadly cold, grudges were shelved. A rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow you might need rescue. In the heart of winter, the village became a family. It was sometimes dysfunctional. It was often very funny. It was always fiercely determined. They were determined to survive together. One muddy boot at a time. One crackling ember at a time. One frozen smile at a time. Faith was a comfort. Bend the cold. When the wind howled outside and the fire shrank to embers, people prayed for divine help. Faith was part of every frozen breath before sleeping. Families knelt together. They offered quick and quiet prayers, prayed for the fire to keep burning. They prayed for the roof to stay intact. They prayed for their toes to remain attached. Saints were called upon for protection. Saint Blaise was asked to protect throats. This was important for breathing. Saint Nicholas was also important. He was not just a gift-giver. He was asked to protect households. Superstitions were part of daily life. Some families sprinkled holy water. They sprinkled it near the hearth before bed. This was to protect against evil spirits, or at least against mischievous drafts. Others marked their doorways with chalk. This was done after certain feast days. They pleaded for warmth and luck. Candles also played a small role. Special vigil candles were sometimes used. They were blessed by a priest or an elder. They were kept burning through the night. They were a flickering plea against the dark. And of course, promises were made to God. People promised to be kinder to neighbors, even the neighbor who stole turnips. Faith was not an abstract idea. It was a daily and urgent conversation. The peasants were not asking for luxury. They were just asking for survival. They asked for little heat and food. They asked for one more day until spring. It was a simple and raw hope. It was whispered into the smoky air. It was tangled in quiet prayers. It was tucked under itchy blankets, and it carried them through the winter nights. Sometimes Winter was too powerful, despite all the ingenuity and prayers, despite all the stubbornness. Winter won, and when it won, it did not take just one person. It could take entire families, could take whole villages that they vanished into the silent snow. Some winters were especially cruel. The Great Famine winter of 1315 was one. Rains destroyed the crops that year. Livestock starved from lack of food. Freezing temperatures made everything worse. People became truly desperate. Stories were whispered about eating leather. They ate tree bark to survive. In the most horrifying cases, they ate each other. Failure to keep the fire alive was fatal. Without the hearth, families huddled together. They did this for the final time. Neighbors would find them in the spring. Their bodies were frozen in an embrace. It was as if they shared heat. Until the end, houses could also collapse. Heavy snow or ice storms could destroy them. A roof falling in at night was catastrophic. It was often a fatal event. Dragging yourself through snow was hard. Begging shelter from neighbors was not guaranteed, especially if those neighbors were also suffering. Disease also loved the cold weather. Starvation weakened the body greatly. Cramped and smoky homes bred sickness. Pneumonia and bronchitis were common. A simple cough in December could be fatal. Frostbite was a quiet horror. Fingers and toes could blacken and die. They died while still attached to the body. Some villagers survived, but lost limbs. It was a grim badge of survival. It said, "I made it, but winter took a piece of me." The most haunting thing was the normality. People accepted that some would not see spring. Death was not an unexpected visitor. It was just another neighbor at the door. It was wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Yet the peasants pressed on. They were stubborn and grieving. They clung to life as long as they could, as long as one ember remained. They fought. There was always a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, we see their hardships and cracked hands. We see their frozen toes and smoky huts. But beneath the struggle is something else. It is a legacy of ingenuity and endurance. They did not have central heating. They did not have thermal jackets. They did not have soft mattresses. They did not even assume they would survive. But what they had was resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress was a testament. Every hand-banked fire was a testament. Every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament. It was human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they adapted. They learned from the land and each other. They learned from each brutal winter. Their communities were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch the sick. They pooled resources when food was low. They trusted that helping a neighbor today meant help for you tomorrow. They lived by a simple understanding. No one beats winter completely alone. Their faith was also a form of endurance. They wove prayers into daily life. It was not just out of fear. Build us also out of fragile hope. Hope that tomorrow would be warmer. Hope that after dark nights, spring would come. Hope that life would push through the frozen ground, and somehow it always did, because of their sacrifices and victories, because they survived one more night. Future generations were able to thrive, bit by frozen bit. Humanity moved forward. They endured winters their ancestors could not, until warmth became a common expectation. It became a distant dream achieved. Their blood and ingenuity are in our lives now. Every cozy blanket we use today, every warm house we live in, every lazy winter evening with tea. It is the result of their refusal to give in. It is the result of countless peasants. They refused to give in to the cold. So, when the wind howls outside your window, maybe think of them for a moment. Think of the nameless and fearless ones. They turned shivering survival into a legacy, one ember at a time, one breath at a time, one stubborn heartbeat at a time.